Welcome back to Veterans Beyond the Wire podcast. I'm your host, Tim Keller. Along with me this week, it's just Mr. Matt Disher. It is Tim and Matt this week. We're here. We're going to chat with you a little bit. But before we get started, I wanted to say Monday, the 7th of December, it was I hate using the word anniversary, but it was the anniversary of the bombing of Pearl Harbor when the Japanese Navy snuck all the way across the Pacific Ocean and they launched a attack on the Navy station in Hawaii. I read some stuff on Monday talking about how someone watching the radars had seen aircraft coming in, but that same day they were supposed to be expecting some American bombers to be coming in from California, I believe. So at the time, those individuals on the radar were told not to sound any alarms. And shortly after, the dive bombers starting slamming their planes into the ships there in Pearl Harbor. So, Matt, you brought up a good point that this year, especially for whatever reason, the COVID, the lockdowns, it's just getting to a certain age. It seemed like the fanfare wasn't there.
Yeah. I wonder, talk about the Lusitania, which was sunk in 1915. That was a rallying cry for people to join World War I. And you can think about other events that you may have learned about in your history books that were, big events in military history. Let's reference for our generation, the ones that we are aware of are Pearl Harbor and of course 9/11. Mm-hmm. And I didn't see as much fanfare on social media this time around. Of course, I see my usual networks, the military pages talking about Pearl Harbor and the attack and remember the attacks and things like that. But we're getting so far in age now that I wonder when that stops showing up for our generation, or if our children's generations will not largely be aware of what Pearl Harbor is. And I know that in my childhood I had met people who were Pearl Harbor survivors, and even more recently, I've bumped into these people who were at Pearl Harbor. So I wonder if we get to a point where at 80 year mark, 90 year mark, Pearl Harbor kind of disappears off the radar, no pun intended. And then at what point does 9/11 become old news? Because if you look at 9/11, that's 19 years ago. Mm-hmm. That's, for us, it seems like yesterday, but it was not that long ago in relative history, but it was 20 years ago. So for your young men and women who are joining the military right now, just as a point of reference, they weren't even alive.
Yeah.
And this is now old news to them. This is something that happened long before they were born.
They've heard the stories.
Right.
Yeah. I think that we're at that age now, Matt, where it's kind of up to us. We need to talk to our children about this. If you're ever lucky enough to vacation or take a trip to a place like Hawaii, we should take the time to make that one of our stops.
Right.
Take your family to those sort of memorials. The 9/11 memorials, the Pearl Harbor memorials, things of that nature, and just allow your children to experience those things. And then hopefully they pass that on as well, because really that's the only way it's going to stay alive. Because once the people that were there have moved on and the people that were alive those days have moved on, it's just left a story.
Well, and these are exceptionally historically significant events. Mm-hmm. If you think about Pearl Harbor in 1941, this was the call to action for the United States to enter World War II. Did I say World War I? Sorry, World War II. In 1941, this was a call to action for the United States to enter the war. And this was a war that had already been raging for a couple of years in Europe, and we weren't involved yet. And if you think about this, somebody asked the question the other day on a military Facebook group. They asked why the Marines were not in the D-Day invasion in Europe in 1944, and a lot of the answers, the Marines chimed in and said, well, the Marines were in the Pacific taking over islands for three years prior to D-Day, so the Marines were all tied up. But it was a major event in probably the largest conflict in modern history. I mean, there's no doubt about it. If you look at the stats around World War II, I was a big World War II buff as a kid. I know it sounds funny, but I loved researching it. The stats are just outrageous in terms of deaths and machinery and injuries and people involved and how many countries were involved and the square footage of land that was traded in size, in conflict, like invasions happening and people gaining and losing land. As it goes in the Pacific, Midway is a good movie. It recently came out, I think 2 years ago. It's a little bit Hollywood, but it's a good movie no less, and it shows the real imagery of how hard it was for these guys to track each other down. You think, like, these days we know where ships are, we know where airplanes are. They had no idea. They had scout planes out there flying over the ocean trying to track down fleets of Navy. So it's really not a surprise. You mentioned before that these guys were looking at the radar and they were like, well, what's going on here? It's really not a surprise that they had no idea that there were Japanese aircraft carriers just off the coast of Hawaii. And they snuck in and kind of came around and then launched aircraft for a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Then they couldn't, after that attack, they couldn't figure out where the aircraft carriers were. And so there was this exchange of people trying to find each other in the ocean, in the vast ocean of the Pacific, in airplanes that move 300 miles an hour at a time. So it's a pretty historical event. But I do wonder when the fanfare goes away and when we start to fade away, by the time we are old men, we're almost there. By the time we're old men, do we not see Pearl Harbor on social media? And by the time we are, laying on our deathbeds, will 9/11 have disappeared? Will we forget about that?
I hope not. And I know personally that a big part of basic training in the Marine Corps in boot camp, you do learn a lot of this history. They focus a lot, they teach you these dates to remember and the reasons why. And I'd like to think that the other services do as well. So hopefully the armed forces continue to do those sort of things and teach these young men and women that come through about the importance of these dates. That way it never officially dies out. At least there'll be some segment of the population that always remembers. So,
right, 100%.
Yeah, just kind of wanted to highlight that. And as always, we like to try to get into some news. I actually have here's a couple. There's a bunch of good news out there, but I wanted to highlight three. I pulled up 3 articles off of military.com, as we always do. The first one is talking about the House down in DC has approved a wide-ranging defense policy bill. It is a $731 billion defense bill, won by the vote of 335 to 78. Came hours after President Trump renewed his threat to veto the bill. Trump is threatening to veto this bill because there are some terms in here that kind of shield places like Twitter, Facebook, and other tech giants from content liability. He feels he was treated unfairly on social media during the election. And he also wants to strip out a provision that would allow the renaming of military bases that now honor Confederate leaders. Congress vowed to move ahead on the hugely popular bill, which affirms a 3% pay raise to U.S. troops, which I don't see anything wrong with that. Obviously, I know when we were in, it wasn't great pay, and I can't imagine it's gotten a ton better since then. So I would hope that at least the pay raise would go through. I know that there's a bump in hazard pay as well as the housing pay, things that the military members need. And at this point, if certain places are named for some individuals that possibly were on the wrong side of history, let's go ahead and rename some things. I'm not against that.
I saw that coming. I've seen that coming for quite some time.
Yeah.
It's a sign of the times, and I don't. Yeah. I'm neutral on the subject. I understand the frustration. Maybe that's not the right word because these are historical figures. I understand the pushback. But I think that there's a lot of context there. There's a lot of reasons, historically why some of these bases were named after these different people, and I think there's more history behind it than what we see on media. But I sit neutral kind of in that space where, I understand. I understand if we had a military base named after any other enemy of the United States, we would be like, why do we have this base?
Yeah.
And I am also of the mindset that just because it is history and just because it is tradition doesn't mean it's right. So it's kind of I think it's worth a larger discussion. I think that even the budget piece, the $700 billion budget piece that you just described too, the way that these bills are written and why there is pushback and why there needs to be more approvals and why people are for and against, and you have these votes, there's a lot more context that goes into that as well. We, as the consumer of media, we don't always see the context there, but these bills, as you know, Tim, I mean, for any of us who kind of pay attention to it, these bills are also rife with pork sometimes. They put a bunch of other nonsense in these bills. That's why you have pushback. Now, I don't know about this one specifically. I don't think Trump is threatening to veto because of that. But traditionally, when you see one side get rid of a bill and another side push a bill and stuff like that, and the reason why there's this big bipartisan push and pull is because there's a lot of stuff that's probably written in there that doesn't benefit the other side. Mm-hmm. And so, that's how they slip things into the budget to spend money that people probably necessarily wouldn't be okay with. So
I think a lot of it depends on what chunk of some of these bills and laws certain individual politicians read or their people read for them. Because like you said, there's pages 1 through 5 might actually pertain to what this is about, giving the pay raises and the housing and the hazard pay and all that. And then on page 18, there's going to be something about, you can't paint an elephant pink in Iowa City. And it's going to be none of it. Like, this doesn't matter. Why don't we take that out? But then somebody that wants that for whatever reason is going to, no, it has to be in there or I'm going to veto all.
Right. Or we need $100 million to paint an elephant pink.
Yeah.
That's the pork that's thrown in there. It's,
I'm trying to think of the libertarian candidate from a few years ago. His son, oh God,
Gary Johnson.
No, his son is now a congressman or senator from Kentucky.
Yeah.
What's his name? Anyways, they're big in the Libertarian Party. They were great for that, where they would have a 500-page document for a bill.
Ron Paul.
There you go.
Rand Paul.
Rand Paul and Ron Paul, where there'd be a 500-page bill, and one side would be saying, well, we want this out. And then the other side would say, oh my God, they're going to veto A, B, and C, which are all good things because they want this.
Yep.
But then, the Pauls would stand up and say, okay, here's all this BS in here. And just how many pages have you actually read? Because I read the entire thing.
Right.
And 450 of these 500 pages are garbage.
Yeah.
Let's actually write a law that matters, get rid of the garbage. And I always found that very intriguing because they would let us in on a lot of that, because until that stuff's passed, we really don't see what everything is written in there.
Right.
And, to have somebody standing on that sort of platform saying, I'm not against A, B, and C. I'm just against everything else from D down to Z because it's all garbage. So I always thought that was interesting. So I'm not saying that there's not anything in there that isn't garbage. Hopefully obviously the pay raises, the housing adjustments, the hazard pay, all of those things, anything that will actually benefit military members, I would like to see get passed. Obviously, I personally, I think that, probably social media needs somebody to take a good look at them and check out exactly what they're doing. They probably have a little too much power, but I'm not that person. I can't do it.
I mean, I think we've seen over the course of 2020, I think we've seen, this is a great example. People are distrustful of government. People are distrustful of the media. I think that there have been a certain element of people who have been that way for a number of years. It's nothing new for this year, but with all of the events and happenings, I think that a lot of the current events and media and investigators and guerrilla reporters, and what I mean by that is the people who are taking that information, trying to get it out there. They can use social media to put information out that generally would not be put out. I think that it has caused people to see a little bit more now. Unfortunately, and I don't want to get into politics on the podcast, but unfortunately, I think that I think people. I use the analogy. It's like sports. I think people are okay with certain things being wrong as long as what they want is going okay. And I'll use that as an example. Every 4 years, every time there's an election, There's a certain amount of accusations of voter fraud. We're seeing that now. That was the same thing. Election interference was the last election, et cetera, et cetera. This has been going on for decades now. But again, I'll use the sports analogy. If you're watching a football game on TV and your football team commits a penalty of some sort, does something wrong on the field, but it's not seen, it's not caught by the referees, you're okay with that. Mm-hmm. But if the other team commits a penalty, commits a face mask, and you see it, and you're like, well, wait a minute, that's yardage for us. That's a flag. You're going to be mad.
Come on, refs. Why aren't you doing your job?
Get it? And I mean, it's a great analogy because we're doing the same thing. We do the same thing every 4 years in politics. We are willing to overlook the idea that things are happening or not happening. Mm-hmm. And I'm not taking a side. I'm kind of one of these politically neutral sort of, I'm going to sit on the fence and watch kind of people. But I do see that. And it's funny because when you tell people about that, when you say, hey, this bill doesn't benefit this group, and that's why this other group wants it. People, if their politician was like, yeah, this is a great bill, they're like, no, it's a great bill. But if the opposing politician is like, no, this is a great bill, then they're like, this bill's terrible.
That's a terrible bill.
Right. We don't want anything to do with this.
I heard somebody say this the other day, and I believe it's where I stand, and it sounds like it's kind of where you stand. Somebody was talking about their parents being very liberal. Mm-hmm. And so as the drug companies announced the vaccine, they go, oh yeah, I heard Biden announce that the other day, or not Biden. I heard Pence announce that the other day. Isn't that great? It's amazing how fast the Trump administration got that out, just to upset his mother.
Right.
And his mother goes, are you anti-Biden? He goes, no, I'm absolutely not anti-Biden. I'm just anti-you. I don't have a strong stance on either side. Right. I just find it funny watching YouTube battle it out. Yeah.
Well, and that's and you're exactly right there. That's the other thing. Again, I get called names by both sides on social media because sometimes it's just the sharing of information, and that's where I feel like we've become distrustful this year because of the events of the year, and a lot of people have sort of turned against each other. But overall, I think it's a lack of objectivity. People are not able to say, like, if one politician walked outside right now and said, the sun's out and there's no clouds in the sky, the opposition would say, well, that's a stupid observation,
but it's true. Way over there. It's
right. There's always another way. The glass is half full or it's half empty, I think is another way to put it. But I think the sports analogy really is the best way that I think most people can understand that. If your team commits a foul or a penalty, you're okay as long as nobody sees it. As long as we get what we want. We scored that touchdown after all of our guys just face masked the opposition. Or we stepped out of bounds, we still got that touchdown. But if the other team does it, we're mad. Yeah. Right?
Yep.
Because that's who we're supporting. So I wish I had a larger stage to say that, because I really do feel like we've lost the ability, and I've said this for 10 years now, we've lost the ability to have really good debates. Everybody has their biases, and the media is biased, and politics has become a polarizing issue. I got a political science degree when I left the Marine Corps, and that was one of the things that my political science professors talked about a lot that I didn't understand until relatively recently, and it was the idea of polarization. Mm-hmm. That it's pulling people apart, and in government will become less efficient and less effective as we become pulled apart.
Tribalism as well. They're
right. It is.
Everybody's building a tribe, and and for the next 4 years, one tribe will yell at the other that they're ruining everything, and then we'll have this great battle again. And one team will be happy, one team will be sad, and then we'll get to point fingers over and over and over again. It's just this crazy fun cycle.
Yep.
So,
yep.
I don't know.
It is what it is.
I don't necessarily have an answer either.
There's no answer.
I personally, I think maybe add a third team to the mix, maybe.
Well, in some countries there are, multiple parties, multiple major parties, not even 3, but like 5 and 6.
Yeah.
And I mean, imagine how much accountability there would be if now you had 6 options to choose from, 6 real options to choose from, and each one of them wasn't spending $5 billion on their campaigns.
When it's it just simple math, not trying to get polluted. It's simple math. If there's only two, you have to choose A or B.
Right.
If A wins, everybody from B gets to point the finger at A and say, you're messing everything up.
100%.
If B wins, everybody from A gets to point the finger at B and say,
Right.
you're messing everything up. If there's no other options, nobody else can step in and say, you're both being idiots.
Right.
Stop it. Let's actually try to fix something. So,
right. Well, and I think it's common sense for us, you know, in the military, we've always talked about this. Like there are, I've mentioned this before. There are no politics in a foxhole.
Mhm.
You know, when you're getting shot at, I don't care what side you're on. And so I think we're probably a little bit unique in that regard. People who have served in the military are unique in that regard. And probably business leaders in some cases are unique in that regard, where you can look at things objectively and say, this is good for us or it's bad for us. It has nothing to do with who signed it or who recommended it or which party paid $1 million to have lobbyists go do it. It's good or it's bad. It's good for business or it's bad for business. Good for people or it's bad for people. You know, back to the original topic, a lot of times that is because we don't know what's in the bill.
Mhm.
We don't know what they're asking for when taxes have to go up. That's people are like, whoa, you know, stop taking my stuff. Why is this going up? And I think probably politicians and media need to do a little bit better job of educating instead of just making statements. You know, conversations like this, like we're having right now, other podcasts that I listen to, it's where I get really good information and I hear different perspectives. And sometimes professionals come on there and talk about these topics. And it makes a lot more sense at that point.
I would say I've spent the past year almost now really diving in, paying attention to, and trying to develop my own personal leadership skills and abilities, try to build them up, make them even better.
Mm-hmm.
And I listen and read things from very intelligent people that, you know, this is their main focus. And almost all of them will agree that explaining the why,
right?
You know, you can't just dictate and say, this is what we're doing. Sometimes you need to explain the why.
Right.
And when you communicate the why, people understand the overall vision and they're more willing to, oh, I get it now. Let's go. They understand the mission, let's say, to keep it in military terms. And they're willing to be an active participant in completing the mission.
Right.
If more politicians spent the time possibly explaining the why, like, hey, here's this bill. This is why I voted no.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we talked about the rants coming out and saying, this is why I voted no, because there's 450 pages of this 500-page bill that really have nothing to do with anything.
Right.
And until we're willing to cut the fat, I'm going to continue to vote no.
It's basic communication too. I mean, this is what great businesses are run off of: solid communication. Everybody understanding what's happening and why it's happening.
Absolutely.
And as soon as the best way to put it is, as soon as people don't understand things, they become disenfranchised. And that is where you are able to create that polarization. And I think in some cases the polarization is on purpose. It's on purpose. I mean, you want people to push against the opposition, especially in politics. That's how they get what they want.
Well, we use that example of the $100 million to paint an elephant pink.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe for some reason that actually does need to happen. That individual that wants that in that bill needs to stand up and say, hey, this may sound awkward and weird and just completely stupid to so many people, but here's actually what's happening.
Right.
And if we paint this elephant pink, we're going to save, 10,000 children, youth cancer patients.
Right.
Oh my God. Well, by all means, let's go paint that elephant pink.
There's a reason.
A paintbrush right here in the garage. Let's go.
Yep.
But without anybody standing up and explaining those communication, I think there's a large gap between, the government and the people they're supposed to govern. The lack of communication there and openness. So I think we spent enough time on this one. We went down some avenues and some alleys there.
2 days later.
The second article I pulled out was about President-elect Joe Biden and his Secretary of Defense. His pick is General Lloyd Austin, former Army general, and why they have a crisis-tested bond forged in the Situation Room. Much like, everybody's favorite defense secretary, General Mattis, it appears that General Austin is also going to need the waiver. He's not been out of uniform for over 7 years.
Yeah.
So he's also going to need the waiver to get in. but General Mattis has won the Silver Star. He has led Army
General
units.
Austin.
I'm sorry?
General Austin has a Silver Star.
Yes, General
Yeah.
Austin has a Silver Star. He was the first African-American general to command an Army division in combat, as well as serve as commander to the U.S. Central Command. So the gentleman, General Austin, is definitely he's definitely been there. He's definitely done these things. I think Biden wants somebody, as the article states, who understands the human cost of war firsthand.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's very good. I mean, we've been in these conflicts over in Iraq and Afghanistan for 20 years now. At some point, these things have to end. We can't continue to do this forever.
It's unsustainable.
Yeah. So I like the fact that the president has gotten somebody that understands what the actual cost is. There's a dollar's cost and there's a human cost. And anybody can look down at a spreadsheet and understand the dollar's cost. Anybody with any sort of analytical mind can do that. But for somebody that's been there and seen these individuals pay with their blood, their sweat, their tears, the separation from family members, loved ones, missing holidays, missing births, missing anniversaries, graduations, and then some of them not being able to come home at all, ever. Having somebody in that place that understands what that is actually like, I think, is a beyond valuable asset. So obviously I've never served with, under, or around this gentleman, but I can't doubt his acumen for understanding the military.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard on, not specific to this general, which, by the way, and I think you alluded to this in his career so far, he will be the first black leader of the Pentagon, Secretary of Defense.
Yes,
which I think it's another milestone in the military. And it again, when we talk about perspectives, it brings perspectives, more perspectives, different perspectives. I've heard this conversation a couple of times around whoever leads the Pentagon, whoever the Secretary of Defense is. And, we saw this with General Mattis. There was a desire to keep some of the conflicts going at a certain rate in Afghanistan. And I think Donald Trump pushed back on that and said, no, we don't need this. My curiosity, I think my curiosity is that these are, at any rate, and of course, I think that anybody leading the Pentagon should be prior military, should be somebody who has served, because again, they understand the cost of battle and what that goes, especially the human cost. But I do wonder, and I've seen this conversation a couple of times, if your entire career is around the military, if your entire career is in the armed forces, does that skew your perspective on whether or not we should use force in certain situations or be more diplomatic? And this isn't me asking the question necessarily. It's more of a conversation topic, that the desire for General Mattis, for example, to continue conflict or maybe add to conflict. I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but to continue the discussion about elevating troops in Afghanistan, is that because his career has been in the military, and that is how the generals think, versus having a non-military person in that office saying, we really don't need to go and continue this battle. We don't need to go continue this 20-year conflict almost. So it's more hypothetical. So I think it's more of a conversation to have, that, and I'll say this half jokingly, when we are in the military and we're thinking about going into like an urban conflict, we're the hammers, they're the nails. To a hammer, everything is a nail, I think is probably a better way to put it. Does that apply? And it's a hypothetical question again. Does that apply in the Pentagon? Are these people hammers and everything's a nail, and that's the way that we solve problems? Or is there a more educated, refined, probably is a better way to put it, refined political diplomatic way to look at conflict?
Is there a way we can possibly use these nails to our benefit without having to hammer them?
Right. Or to avoid it, avoid bringing out the hammer,
Well, Well, this article says that the general does strongly agree with President-elect Biden that military force should be used primarily as a last resort.
Mhm.
And at this point, I think it's probably the best idea. I know as a younger man and seeing a guy like Mattis get in, Marines absolutely love General Mattis. He was a war dog. He was
Right.
all about it. He has
Right.
some absolutely amazing quotes. Many of us know them. So maybe there were some definitely conflicts of interest between him and President Trump. So it seems like at least this pick and the future president seem to agree on a lot of this. So hopefully they can get some things done.
Yeah.
And then the last one, this is kind of the it's not funny, but hey, there's some fun here, I guess. I don't know. It's a year later, and the NCIS is still looking for the rifles that went missing from 3rd Battalion, 6th Marines during a training exercise in North Carolina. The NCIS spokesman, Jeff Houston, was quoted as saying, "The rifles have not been located and no charges have been filed at this point." Last year, about this time, some grunts from 3-6 were on a training exercise. 3 rifles and 3 flak jackets went missing. The entire unit was locked down. Christmas was canceled. Santa Claus did not visit the unit as the unit was locked down, and they began to search for the weapons. Commanding officers and top enlisted leaders from 3-6 were later removed from their jobs. It was one of those where no one said this was because of the missing rifles, but it's also, hey, we just decided to remove all of our top leadership shortly after something like this happens.
Right.
Hey.
It got some news. Let's talk about this for a second, because if you can imagine the worst thing ever to happen to you anywhere in the world, the worst thing that can happen at work, it's like a bad dream where you show up to school with no pants on. Losing your rifle in the Marine Corps is the worst thing that could ever happen to you. If you step away from your rifle for 5 seconds, for more than 10 feet, it's not within arm's length.
If it's out of arm's length, it is too far away.
Yeah, that was a huge no-no. These days I'm not an official instructor, but when I take people shooting on the gun range, for example, people who are less experienced, one of the first, I teach them the gun safety rules, but one of the first things I say is, obviously you're keeping your finger off that trigger. The trigger should be a really bad thing, but it should be a bad thing unless you want to make it go, but don't ever touch the trigger. You should have anxiety about touching the trigger. And I teach them to keep their fingers straight and off the trigger. And they're like, how do you get that right every time? I'm like, because it was pounded into us physically in the military. Like if you were touching the trigger, somebody would run up and, slam their body into you or do something. But the other thing was that it's weapons accountability. You always have to know where your weapon is. And it blows my mind. And I don't know if this was on purpose or who these devil dogs were that lost their stuff, but oh my God, I can't. I mean, you already said it, Tim. The amount of people that lost their jobs in senior leadership, that gives you some sort of inkling. That's the easy part on the top end. The guys at the bottom.
Yeah, I was going to say the guys at the top that were removed from their jobs, they probably had 15 plus years in. They were closing in on retirement. Some of them probably had the 20 years. Some of them probably got to retire honorably. It's that PFC, that Lance Corporal that walked away from his weapon for more than 10 seconds. And that's one of the magic weapons that walked away. That individual was probably NJP'd and probably given a separation without honorable, mention. So
it's a disaster.
It is. It's a major thing for anybody in the military, but yeah, especially in the Marine Corps. I was actually watching a documentary on the Army Green Berets the other night. It's called 3 Weeks in Hell. I believe it was on Hulu or Netflix.
Mm-hmm.
And they were doing a night ruck. They're kind of left to their own. They have a certain time limit they have to pass. If they get to, I have to stop, readjust my gear. I have to sit down and catch my breath for a couple seconds. But one of the individuals did that, sat down, adjusted gear, took a rest, whatever it was, got up and continued walking, and then realized, oh God, I don't have my rifle. And I'm laying there in bed beside my wife, and I go, uh-oh. She goes, what? And I go, if he doesn't find his rifle, it's over. He's done. It doesn't matter. He could be the best possible option for the Green Berets. If he's lost his weapon, he's dead. He cannot fight. They will not accept him into the Green Berets just for this one thing.
Yep.
She goes, really? I go, yeah, absolutely. I said, I said, you could put anybody out there. Any human is just a human. You put a trained soldier, Marine, whoever, you put somebody out there with a weapon, they are then a warrior. I said, without a weapon, that guy is useless to this unit.
Yeah.
I said, it stinks. That's the way it is. And luckily this gentleman backtracked and got extremely lucky and found it alongside the road.
Until his cadre watched that video later on. This guy's in Afghanistan kicking doors down. They're like, hey, we saw this video that got released on Discovery Channel 2 years later. Yeah. You're done.
I will say much of it, I was like, wow, they do push these guys. Some of the stuff was stuff, I'd already done. But in that moment, that short little segment of this about hour and a half documentary was that 2 minutes that really had me going. I was like, oh God.
Yeah.
Everything else is they're training. I get it. I get this.
Right.
And then that 2 minute segment, I'm like, oh, this is somebody losing their dream. I was like, oh God.
Right. Yeah. Everything they've worked for. It's not just they showed up to this test one day. This is like years of conditioning. Training and conditioning.
And
right.
And they were tired and they had one mental slip and it's like, oh God. This is why you've made it 2.5 of the 3 weeks.
Yep.
And you've left your rifle set and bye-bye.
I don't know if we've talked about this before, but when I was younger in the Marine Corps, my first couple of years, I was with 1st Marine Division, 1st Combat Engineer Battalion. We were attached to Fox Company 2-1, which are amphibious raid. It's an amphibious raid company, so Zodiacs. And we were doing the boat school. We were doing all the boat raid trainings with the SOTG, the Special Operations Training Group in Southern California. And so we'd go out and do these raids with Fox Company 2-1, where we'd pull the Zodiacs out of the boathouse and we'd put them out in the water and do ready circles. And then go out in the ocean to a waiting ship 20 miles out, come back in, do our raid on a beach, blow some things up. By this time you've been awake for 2 days. You're just exceptionally tired. So sometimes we do like back-to-back raids where we do one raid and then we come back and regroup and then do another raid just to get a little bit of experience. And some of us had the night vision goggles, and the night vision goggles, it's my understanding that back then the night vision goggles were somewhere around like $10,000 a piece. This was serialized gear, just like your weapon. Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's not like you lost a magazine in the ocean and, oh, well, we'll just go get another one. Yeah. This is serialized gear. So what we would do with our night vision goggles was, they were big and bulky. We didn't want to carry them around. We're going to eat chow and stuff. So we'd have our weapons drop. We'd have a gear guard, somebody watching the weapons, and the night vision goggles. And the night vision goggles, since we were in the ocean, we'd have them wrapped in plastic trash bags. Somebody mistook at a gear dump. Somebody mistook I had them in a black Glad bag. No. Somebody mistook my night vision goggles for trash. And I don't know how this happened. This goes against everything that a gear guard is. You're not supposed to touch anything in that gear pile. The weapons are stacked. And inside of the stack was the night vision goggles, and only a few of us had them. And mine disappeared. And the only thing that the gear guard could come up with was that there was some dude police calling trash, and he must have picked them up and they didn't notice. Somebody was screwing around and didn't notice. Picked up a heavy plastic bag and threw it in the dumpster. So I'm going dumpster diving at 2:00 in the morning after the raid force was over and everybody went back to bed. Myself and my squad leader were out there. I was in so much trouble. I was going to be in so much trouble. And arguably, in the Marine Corps, of course, it's all my fault. It's my gear, so it's my responsibility. But this was something that I had nothing to do with. And I was very frustrated. I was very angry because I was like, I've been in the Marine Corps for 1.5 years, 2 years at this point. My career is gone. I'm going to go out. They're going to kick me out. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I found my night vision goggles in that dumpster. After we looked everywhere, I assumed somebody sold them and they were or stole them and they were going to go sell them on the black market, which is what I'm probably sure happened to these rifles at this point. Somebody's going to get pulled over in Texas somewhere in 6 years. They're going to get pulled over by the cops. They're going to search a car, and there's going to be one of these M16s or one of these M4s, whatever it was that's missing. $100 says they'll turn up, or it'll be the same kind of weapon with the serial number scratched off.
Yeah,
but it always comes around. It's going to show up. Somebody will show up with it. Somebody will do something stupid with it. Whether or not it's involved in a crime, that's the big thing. But let's hope that it shows up.
Well, I'm glad you found your night vision goggles. That's for sure.
I don't know what I'd be doing these days if I didn't find those night vision goggles. I probably would have offered to say, I would have said like, hey, just dock my pay because I want to stay in the Marine Corps. But the other understanding that I always had,
you'd still be in the Marine Corps then trying to pay them off.
You're right. Because if they were like 10 grand. But the other understanding that I always had is that those night vision goggles had the infrared in them. So like when we used the PEC 4s and the PEC 2s, the little laser sights on our rifles that were invisible to the naked eye.
Yeah, you could see
you can see the dot. But if you go buy a set of those from Dick's Sporting Goods or Cabela's or something like that, they're not infrared. They don't see infrared light. So your infrared chem lights and your PEC 2s and PEC 4 lasers they're all invisible unless you have those specialized ANPVS 9s or whatever they're called, whatever they were called. Anyway, I found them. All is well. They were in the bottom of a dumpster with some ketchup on them and some other stuff. We got them.
So they were a little more delicious, but thank God you found them.
They tasted delicious.
They were amazing.
Right.
So, well, I had never heard that story. That is, I completely understand that scenario. Coming back and being, where's my stuff?
Everybody else's stuff is here. Where's mine?
Where'd my NVGs go? Like what's happening?
And being a young Lance Corporal at the time, I'm thinking to myself, like somebody's screwing with me. Like the older guys are screwing with me because I came into this platoon kind of late. They'd already gone through like sapper school and stuff like that, and I wasn't with them. So I got to come in to like the middle of the workup of the evolution for the float, and so I got to miss a lot of the. I mean, we still did the boat stuff was hard. I mean, it was physically exhausting and you're freezing cold.
They were already a bonded team and you're the new guy. So you're expecting a little bit of that poking and jabbing and.
Yeah. But I also was very intentional. We had Bart Cole, who we had on the podcast, who shared his story about Iraq. Bart was in my platoon. He was one of those guys. So I earned their respect very fast. Although I was a junior, I came in there and I was like, I'll do whatever I got to do to be one of the guys, And so that was what was surprising. I was like, well, who's screwing with me then? Because I thought we were all cool.
Yeah.
But that's what I thought. And then it became apparent that after like an hour, nobody was messing around. This was for real. Somebody picked up my my night vision goggles and sold them in Mexico for all I knew.
If you didn't find the night vision goggles, I probably just would have stayed in the dumpster.
I know.
This is where I live now. Come get me.
Hey, Corporal, I'm just gonna stay in here. I'm gonna be a deserter.
I live here.
I'm not coming back. Yeah.
Oh, that man. Yeah, I can understand being extremely concerned and worried about that.
Yep.
Well, we definitely chatted up on some topics today, but let's get to what we kind of talked about last night when we talked about just you and I here. Some of the things we mentioned last night, the emotions of going from the military to the civilian world. I know that in the past you've talked about, especially once you get home. I know for me, you get that DD 214 and it's one of the best feeling. Like, when I got in, I didn't know if I was going to do 4 or if I was going to do 40, but it got to a certain point and certain things in my career at that point. I was like, you know what? I've done what I've wanted to do with these first 4 years. Let's see what else is out there. So the day I got that DD 214, I was very elated. I was happy. I was excited. But then that excitement quickly wore off. And then you're left with the question, okay, now what? Unlike some people, and what we're trying to do is help these individuals. I didn't really plan. I saved up a couple dollars and was like, figure it out. I'll figure it out. I always seem to figure it out. We'll do it again.
Yep.
But you've mentioned personally that you go in, you have that interview, you come out, and it's the 4th or 5th no in a row, or we just not at this time. We don't think you're the right fit. And you're out there pounding on the steering wheel and the frustration. So there's waves and different waves, and they're constant of excitement, not paranoia, but confusion.
Maybe even some paranoia. I don't.
You're excited, and you're hoping for the best, and you're looking forward to all the new opportunities, and then one by one, some of these opportunities don't land in your lap, and then you start to get frustrated and concerned, and you can find yourself depressed very quickly.
Yeah, there's different levels of preparation too. So, you and I spent 4 years in the military. I went in the military. Everybody in my family spent 4 years in the military. Nobody has been a careerist in the armed forces. So it never occurred to me that I could spend 20 years in the military. It never seemed like a real idea for me. I have the utmost respect for people that do it. It just wasn't in the cards for me. I wanted to do some service and then get out and come home, and do the rest of my life as I had envisioned it, in the suburbs and whatever. And so there are different levels of preparation. We talk about the emotional changes that have to happen. So for those of us who spend a couple of years in right after high school, for example, our entire adult life at that point is the military. Mm-hmm. We get out of high school. We are kids in high school. We played sports. We did whatever we did. We had girlfriends and boyfriends, and we went out, maybe partied a little bit before we were supposed to legally. But then we went in the military, and
then we really learned how to party.
Then we really learned how to party professionally, around the world too. So you're well-cultured partiers. But then you get out, and let's say you do 4 or 5 years, which is the average. I think the average enlistment, or I'm not going to use the word average, but most people do 4 to 8 years. Mm-hmm. That's usually where people sit. So most people probably around 4 or 5 years. Your entire adult life has been wearing this uniform. And of course, it also depends on what sort of element or unit you were in. In our case, Tim, we were combat engineers. I was frequently, in the first half of my military career, most of my military career, was attached to an infantry unit doing combat training or operations or something along those lines.
The fun stuff.
Yeah, the fun stuff. The stuff that you see in video games, but in real life, you're really tired, and you're tired of cleaning your weapon because you're always shooting it. Sweaty. Yeah, you're covered in dirt. You smell bad. And so that, at least in the Marine Corps, my experience was it was aggressive. It was violent. The people you're with, they're great people. They're the most amazing people you'll ever meet. But the culture is very aggressive. And so when you come out of the military after just a couple of years, where your entire adult life so far has been, pounding dirt and shooting guns. And, in some cases it might be on a flight line. You 18 to 22 years old, you might be on a flight line dealing with aircraft. You might be on a ship. You might be doing all these different things. And some of these things are fun. What I realized was, I got out, and I'm at a Christmas party with a girl I was dating at the time and my family. And I realized I kind of looked around and had this moment of anxiety where I'm like, I don't fit here. I don't belong here. Mm-hmm. This was like a month after I got out. I got out in November, actually. So November of the year, I came home. And it was just a very strange time. It was holidays. Everybody's like, la, 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 life goes on. And I'm sitting here trying to make this adjustment to like fitting into the room. So, there's that piece of it. I think when we talk about the transition from the military, a lot of times they don't talk about the emotional transition. And for each person, the emotional transition is different. Mm-hmm. And I don't know how to coach somebody on that. I don't know how we can have a conversation here that solves for that, as much as it is just be prepared to mentally and emotionally get out of the military, hang up the uniform, and put on a suit and a tie or a polo shirt. And
I would say, speaking about this now, knowing, speaking to individuals that are preparing to get out or have just gotten out of the military, and speaking to this now, be prepared. There's going to be waves of emotions, different emotions, and you don't know when they're going to come and when they're going to hit. We would hope and we wish that everybody could get out, land on their feet, and just roll right into it. It's not the case for so many, though. With today's tools, though, I would suggest, like Matt, you and I both got out within 2 months. I got out in September. You got out in November that year. If there was a social media, you, me, Hoffman, Spence, the guys that were going to get out within a 6-month window of each other, if we had a social media, and it, I think it's tough, especially for younger. I know myself, a young man. It would have been tough to reach out to, hey, Matt, how you doing? Because
Right.
I'm kind of struggling. Or, hey, Hoffman, how you doing? I'm having a rough go.
Yep.
What are you facing? What are you looking at? With these tools, these social media tools we talked about earlier, we kind of hit on some, maybe some of these things need to be looked at a little bit more, but there are positive sides to it.
Yep.
In your units, these people that you've forged these bonds with, the individuals that are also going to exit their service at roughly the same time. Continue those bonds, share ideas, have discussions. If you're dealing with depression, if you're dealing with stress, if you don't know what's next, have conversations with these guys, because they're going through the same things you are. Believe me, they are. And just be a support group for each other. There's plenty of veterans groups that get together and do activities. They go on rucks, they go on runs. There's the team Red, White, Blue. I know there's chapters all across the country. You can join one of those. I know they do multiple events throughout the week. There's online yoga sessions. There's online workouts. You can do virtual runs. You can meet and do in-person runs.
Yep.
Things of that nature. It's
Team Rubicon is another. It's a veteran-based
Yes.
disaster relief organization. Every time there's a tornado or a hurricane or an earthquake or something like that, Team Rubicon is mobilizing people, mostly veterans. It's not a veteran exclusive, but mostly veterans, to go out and help clean up. And it's a team-based element. So, hey, put down the machine gun, come out of the military, and go help people in a community during a disaster. So, yeah, there are a bunch of different options to gain the community, which, Tim, that brings up a great point at a larger conversation topic, and that is the loss of community. Mm-hmm. I am convinced, and I'm trying to put together some sort of publication about this. It's just a work in progress. It's a lot of brainstorming right now, but I'm convinced that if you get people to prepare a year out for the military transition, so whether they've done 25 years or 4 years, get them to start preparing a year out, get them familiar with financial acumen. Their personal brand is something that you and I were texting about last night, and I'll talk about that in a second. Get them to become emotionally aware, emotionally connected to the idea that this is going to be kind of tough, that it's going to be an entire lifestyle change. And of course, everybody wasn't kicking doors down and shooting guns. It's just the nature of the military is, in many cases, it's structured chaos. It is very well defined. The culture is very defined, et cetera, et cetera. And suddenly you get out and you're not with that community of people who think and dress and act like you. You're getting out to a society that largely, I hate to say it, largely doesn't care about your service. They care from a social standpoint. They're proud to have people that have served in the military. And of course, during conflict, they're proud to know somebody who has put on that uniform and gone to war. But in short, they don't care, nor do they know what your military service entailed. And so the idea that, you and I were walking down the hallways in Okinawa, Japan, like, yeah, we just did this cool training operation. And like, we all are aware of each other's capabilities. Now you're walking down the hallway with your coworkers who have no idea what you've just committed to for 4 to 25 years, And so a piece of that is being able to sell yourself. I mentioned personal brand. Personal brand is your ability to be able to sell yourself to anybody. Your ability not to say, hey, I've got these medals and I did this stuff in the military, but it's more so a definition of who you are and who you're going to be from this point forward. And as you know, I interview people what feels like 100 times a day. I interview people for different jobs. That's my job. I find talent leaving the military and I plug them into opportunities. I can't tell you how many people I run into that they have not developed a personal brand. Not that they knew that they were supposed to, but they don't know what they're doing next. They don't know what they're supposed to be looking for right now. They have no idea how to grab and mold and form the idea of what comes next in their job, in their educational career, in their family, et cetera. And that's where I feel like if you start 1 year out, you start talking to people like, all right, what do you want to do? They're not going to tell you like, hey, I want to go work at Amazon. They're not going to know that right off the bat, or maybe they will, but they're not going to tell you right off the bat. What they're going to say is, I really enjoy working with people. I want to go fold papers. I want to tie people's shoes, and I'm using silly generalities here, but if you could take those three things and say you like to fold papers and you like to tie shoes, well, here, go work at the shoe factory.
I was going to say go to a preschool. I mean, you get a bunch of kids that don't know how to tie shoes and arts and crafts.
Right. But in all reality, so that's, I mean, you bring up a good point. If you like working with children and you have the utmost patience, maybe pursue a career in education and try to figure out how you're going to get there. So you mentioned before the networking community. That's where people have to start. And a lot of them are not prepared. They're not being given these answers a year out. They're finding out these answers 6 months out, 3 months out. And by then, if you remember 3 months before your exit from the military, you're maybe already trying to figure out how you turn in some of your gear. If your unit is deploying or going to a training exercise. I know for me, when I was leaving, the unit was supposed to deploy to, or some part of our unit was supposed to deploy to somewhere in Southeast Asia, and I didn't go because I wasn't ready. Yeah, maybe it was the Philippines. I forget exactly.
I believe there was talk about the Philippines before I left.
It probably was. Yeah. So I was like, well, I'm not going to go to that because I'm leaving, or I can extend. And so there was this, there's this period of time where I was already kind of mentally like, all right, I got to start packing my things up. I know that sounds funny when you're talking about 3 months, but if you get terminal leave, then you're down to 2 months and you're trying to check out and do all your medical checks and all that stuff. So, in short, I think what I'm saying is, and this is probably worth a longer discussion, it's some of the publication that I've been thinking around is, how do we prepare people 1 year out to think about their personal brand, to really start putting some thought into what they want to do post-military, giving them some experience with financial acumen, professional interviewing acumen. And what I mean by that is when you show up for an interview, not just answering questions with yes or no. That's the hardest thing to determine personality, is if it's like, all right, well, tell me what you want to do when you get out of the military. Like, I don't know. I like to work in an office.
I think a lot of the larger companies these days, the style of interviews, it's the open-ended questions where they don't want it. Almost, the questions are almost based so you can't answer with a yes or a no. They're asking, name a time that your team was dealing with a hardship, and how did you help?
Yep, situational based interview.
Yes, that don't. Yeah, it's situational. It's situational answers, and they want real life answers.
Right.
And I think that having individuals, especially that person that's only done the 4, they're still very young. They're 22, 23 years old, 21 possibly even. And setting them up and putting them in those scenarios, asking them those sorts of questions, and guiding them, coaching them on, hey, these are questions you can answer from your military background. Like, let's talk about this. Let's talk about the things you've done, and here's how you can answer these sort of questions with that background. And
how, I think more importantly, how those things are relevant to the job for which you're interviewing. So that's the other thing, is that the unpreparedness shows up generally, which like, well, I was jumping out of airplanes for 10 years. How does that apply to folding papers and tying shoes? It doesn't. Well, it does. It might though, but it might, because you have to, in whatever job, underwater basket weaving, there's a certain level of organization that you have to have. You don't just jump out of an airplane without being organized. You have to check your pack, right? You had to logistically think about how you're going to get where you're going and where you're going to land, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of people by 4 or 25 years are leaders. Actually everybody probably should be some sort of leader in that capacity. You should have some sort of element of leadership under your belt.
I was going to say, I have no doubt if you spent at a minimum 4 years in the military, without even you realizing it, you've become a leader. You've dealt with leadership in some way, shape, or form throughout those 4 years. And the longer you spend, just the more you've been exposed to it. But Matt, you brought up a great point. Jumping out of airplanes for 10 years. You have to study the wind patterns. This is the day what's the weather going to be like? Which way is the wind going to blow? This is where we're going to leave the back of the airplane, and this is our target to where we want to land. What's the wind going to do? What kind of speed are we going to be going at? All that preparedness. Okay. Folding papers. I've never done it as a profession, but I'm going to understand the different types of papers, how hard it is to fold, how many folds can I make in each piece of paper, and what kind of designs do I want? I'm going to do all those kinds of research. That way, when the day comes that I'm there sitting in front of the papers to fold, I'm ready. I know what I need to do, and I know how to do it. So
100%. It's never as simple as yes and no. And really, again, it comes back to that personal brand, understanding how you're going to answer almost any question for almost any job without really fudging or lying about your experience, you can probably sit down for an interview for almost any job and draw some sort of parallel to that job, to what you've been doing. But you got to sit down for that interview. You got to sit down prior to that interview and really think about it and really decide, how am I going to sell myself? I can't come in here with this bland, dry personality. That works for some interviews, but if you're looking for your next good corporate career, leadership career, it's not going to work. You gotta bring your A game. So you're competing with, especially now in COVID, and as we recover from COVID and people go back to work, you're competing with literally everybody. And that's not to scare anybody, but a year ago it was a job seekers market. Job seekers had any job they wanted. Now it's going to be the exact opposite. Employers are going to be able to hire whoever they want right now.
The market is fluid with talent, and the amount of jobs is less.
And people traditionally go back to school. They finish their degrees. When there's an economic downturn, people go back to school and finish degrees. They get new qualifications and certifications and things like that. I don't know if that many people in mass will see some stats probably in the next 6 months, but I know in 2008, 2009, a lot of people went back to law school, got master's degrees, got HVAC certifications. They went back and got all these different certifications because it was like, well, I can't work right now, so let's go use this time to get schooling and further the career. So,
yeah, Matt, and it's one of those where you're talking about doing this a year out, and some people aren't. It's just like an athlete. Some people aren't great at practice and they just play better in games.
Right.
Some people aren't great at interviews, and maybe you're going to be better once if they would just let you out there on the floor folding those papers, you'd be the best paper folder they've ever had. But in that interview, if you never practice, you might flub it.
Right.
Doing these things a year out, hearing these sort of questions, and the first time you prepare for one of these interviews, you might absolutely flub it. But over that year, if you practice 10, 15, 20 times, by that 10th, 15th, 20th time, guess what? You're going to be on point. You're going to have brainstormed and come up with poignant answers to these sort of questions where you can go into that room confidently, sit down in front of that interviewer or sit in front of that screen in front of that interviewer and answer these questions off the top of your head with confidence and exude exactly what you want and sell yourself, sell that brand that you've built over that past year. And, you're going to find much more success that way. You're going to find a better hit rate, I would say. So,
practice makes perfect, as they say.
Absolutely. So, Matt, there's I still have the notes here. So these are things we should definitely come back and visit on another episode at some point, because this is a full conversation in itself about how to build that brand, organize your accomplishments inside and outside the military when looking for that next step. And then, talk about that financial acumen as well. So these are all great things. I have these notes. We'll discuss some of these more at a later date. But Matt, it's been a great conversation. You got anything you want to add before we go?
I'm set. We'll see you next week.
All right. Well, Matt ended it there essentially. So check us out on all the social media platforms, wherever you give us a listen, whatever podcast platform you listen on. Give us a rating, review. That helps us get into the ear holes of other potential listeners that might benefit from things like this. If you are a former military member, a current military member, or anybody that does anything with veterans, we'd love to talk to you. If you think you'd like to be a guest on the show, send us a message on any of the social medias. You can email us, all of those good things. But until next week, we will see you then right here on Veterans Beyond the